In 1983, a translator named Toshihiko Izutsu wrote to Jacques Derrida with a perfectly reasonable request. He was preparing to translate the philosopher's work into Japanese, and he needed a clear, simple definition of his central idea, deconstruction. Derrida replied with several dense pages explaining everything the word was not. It was not a method, it was not a critique, it was not an analysis. By the end of the letter, the translator had an exhaustive list of exclusions, but absolutely no idea what the word actually meant. Because of answers like this, the concept acquired a reputation for being deliberately obtuse. To outsiders, it looked less like a rigorous philosophical tool and more like an exclusive club, an unteachable secret that you either grasped instinctively or didn't get at all. But the evasion was intentional, and there is a logic behind it. A standard definition draws a boundary and pins an idea down so it stays exactly the same from one conversation to the next. Derrida believed meaning is always shifting. To hand over a static definition would be to commit a kind of intellectual freezing, trapping a living process inside a rigid box. This brings us to the most common misunderstanding of the word itself. When people hear deconstruction, they assume it means taking a subject apart into tiny pieces, the way a child dismantles a watch to figure out the gears. But a disassembled watch is dead mechanics. Boris Kriger offers a different view. Meaning operates like a continuous, living river. Krieger's objective is to build a rigorous structural map of this exact movement. He wants to locate the mechanics of how ideas shift and defer to one another, without pretending the motion has stopped. That creates an immediate tension. How do you describe the turbulence of water with exact precision, without draining the riverbed and examining a dry stone? The challenge is mapping the target without turning a living subject into a frozen corpse. The process begins by identifying rigid conceptual hierarchies. For centuries, Western thought elevated the idea of speech as a primary, living expression of truth, while treating writing as a pale, secondary copy. When we notice a biased ranking like this, our default response is to simply flip the order. We elevate the underdog. We champion writing over speech or emotion over reason, declaring the lower term the winner. But doing that solves nothing. The machine that ranks and subordinates is still running perfectly. You have preserved the rigid structure of the hierarchy entirely and merely changed who sits on the throne. To dismantle the machine, Kriger outlines a mechanism he calls a topological swap. This involves taking two connected ideas, what we call conjugate roles, and attempting to completely interchange them within their framework, asking if the system survives the trade. When you try to swap speech and writing, the boundary collapses. You find that speech already shares features of writing, and the two are too deeply entangled to ever separate cleanly. The swap reveals the exact structural joint where the hierarchy breaks down. We can see this exact concept proven mathematically. In 1985, a mathematician named Mikhail Gromov discovered a strange theorem regarding the strict rules of fitting shapes into spaces. This animation shows a three-dimensional sphere attempting to enter a cylindrical tube. The tube is slightly narrower than the ball, but it stretches onward to infinity. Common sense tells us that with infinite length, there is eventually enough total volume inside that tube to swallow the sphere completely. But a hidden mathematical law prevents the fit. There is a finer measure of structure, called capacity, that sheer volume cannot override. No matter how long the tube is, the sphere is blocked. This geometric bottleneck maps directly back to Derrida's philosophy. The physical obstruction blocking the ball is the exact equivalent of the conceptual entanglement that stops us from separating speech and writing. When you attempt the intellectual swap, it always leaves behind an immovable piece of the concept, a residue. It proves that no amount of mere volume, no sheer quantity of words, can ever force a clean separation of deeply entangled ideas. This conceptual residue left behind after a swap is a deliberate, sharply defined outcome. It is a precise structural fact. The deepest, most undecidable questions in human thought actually possess a measurable structural shape. They behave like a knot that catches and pulls tight, stubbornly resisting the tension of being pulled apart. Once you see this geometric shape, the whole practice transforms. It stops looking like a destructive, nihilistic solvent that dissolves meaning and becomes a positive instrument of measurement used to detect the exact limits of our thinking. When you encounter an idea that refuses to be neatly categorized, it can feel like the ground is giving way. Identifying this measurable limit replaces that philosophical vertigo with the calm, steady recognition of a boundary. There is a persistent assumption in academic circles that applying rigorous logic to a complex, mysterious concept will inevitably destroy its depth. Kriger argues the exact opposite. He sees rigor and the unmappable as cooperative partners, doing completely different jobs within the same system. If you want to find the true mystery inside an idea, you have to push a formal structure to its absolute mathematical limit. That is the only reliable way to perfectly isolate the piece of the puzzle that escapes the map. We are no longer forced to choose between the strict, cold lines of logic and the messy, fluid reality of living thought. By charting a rigid idea as far as it can possibly go, we successfully honor both the map and the motion. The structure holds firmly in place, giving us the exact vantage point we need to point directly at the restless residue that refuses to be traded away.